23,000 years ago, somewhere in the mountains above what will one day become Granada, a single human being was alive. Europe was buried under ice. Not the kind you see on a mountaintop. Sheets of ice that reached from the Arctic south to what is now central Germany, crushing the landscape flat, driving the sea level 120 meters below where it sits today. The Strait of Gibraltar was a narrow land corridor. The continent was white and silent and largely empty, and in a cave called Malmorzo, in the last warm pocket of the Western world, someone was breathing. We don't know their name. We don't know their sex. We don't know what they called the landscape around them, or what they believed about the sky, or whether they had any concept of the rest of the continent buried under ice to the north. What we know, what Dr. Vanessa Villalba Muco of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology confirmed in 2023, is their DNA, and what that DNA revealed stopped the research team cold. This individual, 23,000 years old, carried a direct genetic connection to a 35,000-year-old person recovered from Belgium. Two human beings, separated by 12,000 years and 2,000 kilometers. The same ancestral line. Nobody had an explanation for the geography of that connection. Nobody had predicted it. It was simply there, a thread, running across an ice-covered continent, linking two people whose worlds could not have been more different, through something neither of them could have known they were carrying. Hold on to that, because what we just established, this thread of continuous human presence in southern Iberia stretching back 23,000 years, is about to mean something completely different than you think it means. That skeleton in the Granada cave is not the beginning of the Spanish story. It is the evidence of something that was removed, and the science that found it also found exactly when, exactly how completely, and almost nothing about why. Before Rome, before any civilization left its name on Iberian stone, a wave of people swept across this peninsula and reshaped it so completely that an entire male population, generations of men reaching back to that cave, ceased to appear in the genetic record. They left no monuments, no records, no name that survived, only a silence where a chromosome used to be. Before we go any further, I genuinely want to know, drop in the comments, what country or region does your family ancestry trace back to? And if you've done a DNA test, did the results match what you expected? Because what I'm about to show you about Iberia is going to make that question significantly more complicated. Around 7000 BCE, farmers began leaving Anatolia, modern Turkey, and moving west into Greece, into the Balkans, slowly, over centuries, into the heart of Europe. They brought wheat, they brought cattle, they built permanent walls, standard migration, textbook entry. You almost certainly already know this part. What you don't know is what happened when they reached Iberia. Dr. Iñigo Olalde of the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, leading a 111-person international team alongside Harvard's David Reich, assembled genome-wide data from 403 ancient Iberians, people who had lived and died between 6000 BCE and 1600 CE. When they analyzed the genomes of the earliest Neolithic farmers in Iberia and compared them to the hunter-gatherers who had been there before, they found something the standard model hadn't predicted. The hunter-gatherers and the incoming farmers already shared ancestral DNA, not because of recent mixing, because of deep ancient kinship. They weren't strangers arriving at a border. They were something closer to long-separated relatives. Recognizing each other across 15,000 years of divergence, they mixed. The genetic evidence is clear on this. A population took shape in Western Europe's furthest corner, part Anatolian farmer, part Ice Age hunter, blended over centuries into something that felt, from the genomic data, like it had found its form. But here's where it gets strange. Because this moment of apparent continuity, farmers and hunter-gatherers merging peacefully at the edge of the world, was about to be interrupted by something that left almost no record of violence and almost no survivors among the men. The Olalde Reich study recovered genomes from farming settlements along the Portuguese coast, in the plains of Andalusia, in Neolithic burial chambers across the peninsula. The blending was real, the population was stable, the genetic signal was coherent. For nearly 3,000 years, the people of Iberia were exactly who they appeared to be, and then it wasn't that. It wasn't that at all. The population that emerged from that Neolithic mixing Farmers and hunter-gatherers, blended over centuries, should, by every demographic model geneticists had built at the time, have continued. The mathematics said they would persist. They had geographic isolation working in their favor. They had millennia of deep local ancestry. The data said they were stable. The data was catastrophically wrong. The Pontic-Caspian steppe. Imagine a grassland that stretches from what is now Ukraine eastward through Kazakhstan toward the Altai Mountains, a sea of grass so vast that the horizon looks the same in every direction. Around 3000 BCE, this is where the Yamnaya lived. Semi-nomadic herders, they had horses, they had wheeled vehicles, they moved fast, traveled far, and left burial mounds across the steppe, enormous earthen hills that still stand today, visible from miles away. Across flat land that offers no other landmarks, around 2500 BCE, they began moving west. The Reich Lab's analysis, 271 ancient Iberian genomes stretched across 8,000 years, found the steppe genetic signal arriving in Iberia around 500 BCE, sporadic at first, individuals with partial steppe ancestry appearing alongside the existing population, a contact event, a beginning. And then, within approximately 400 years, 16 to 20 human generations, something changed. The signal stopped being sporadic. It became total. There are three things this study revealed about what happened next in Iberia. The first two are significant. The third one is why we're here. The steppe people didn't arrive and quietly blend the way the Anatolian farmers had done 3,000 years before. The genomic data shows a different pattern entirely. The proportion of steppe ancestry in Iberian individuals climbed steeply, generation after generation. And then there is the Y chromosome, the paternal line, father to son, which shows something that does not have a comfortable interpretation. At a Bronze Age burial site in Castillejo del Bonete, a town in Ciudad Real in central Spain, archaeologists found a man and a woman interred side by side. The man's genome carried steppe ancestry. His genetic origin traced back to the Russian grasslands. The woman's genome placed her squarely in the pre-existing Neolithic Iberian population. Her ancestors had been in that landscape for thousands of years. They were buried together, in the same grave, in a site in the center of Spain. And this was not one unusual burial. The same pattern, steppe man, local woman, appeared at site after site, across the length and breadth of the peninsula. What that pattern means is something the data can show and cannot name. By 200 BCE, the genetic data from Iberian burials contains something that, by every demographic model geneticists had constructed, should have taken at least 1,500 years to achieve. It happened in 400, and there are no mass graves, no burned settlements, no archaeological record of the scale of force that the numbers suggest. Let's build the best case for the peaceful version. Because it exists, serious researchers have made it, and it deserves to be heard before it's tested. The argument goes like this. The steppe people had real advantages. They were mobile. They had close contact with animals, which may have given them disease resistance that the local farming communities lacked. They may have been better organized for the kind of social complexity that produces more surviving children. They didn't need to kill anyone. They simply outperformed. More children who survived infancy, more successful partnerships with local women. Over 400 years and 16 generations, their lineage became dominant, not through violence, but through biology. It is a reasonable argument. The Olalde Reich study itself acknowledges what is absent from the record. No mass graves corresponding to this period in Iberia, no burned settlements, no weapon deposits that mark a military frontier. The case for peaceful demographic competition is not fringe thinking. Some of the most rigorous population geneticists working today hold this position seriously. And yet, the data says the exact opposite of gradual. Here is what the peaceful explanation cannot account for. In those 400 years, not just 40% of general ancestry shifted, nearly 100% of the Y chromosome shifted. The female line tells a different story. Mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, mother to daughter, shows a gentler transition. Some Neolithic maternal lineages survived. They are detectable in modern Iberian women today. But the paternal line? The Y chromosome data across Bronze Age Iberia shows it essentially terminated. If this was natural demographic competition, differential fertility, biological outperformance, gradual replacement, You would expect both the male and female lines to shift at comparable rates. You would not expect one line to effectively disappear while the other partially survives. The burial at Castillejo del Bonet, a steppe man and a Neolithic woman sharing one grave. She had survived. Her lineage had survived. His lineage had come from 3 miles away and was now being laid into Iberian ground as if it had always been there. The archaeology found them together. The genetics found them worlds apart. The gap between those two facts has no name that the field is comfortable using. For decades, the standard interpretation held that the steppe migration into Iberia was largely a peaceful demographic process. The 2019 data didn't just complicate that interpretation. It made it arithmetically very difficult to sustain. You cannot lose 100% of your paternal lineage through differential fertility alone in 400 years without something more forceful shaping the outcome. What that something was, the field has not answered. The data only tells you the result. Somewhere between 2500 and 2000 BCE across the entire Iberian Peninsula, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Mediterranean shore of Valencia, from the mountains of Cantabria to the coastline of Cadiz, something happened to the men. Not some of the men, not most of the men. The Ollaldreich study analyzed the Y-chromosomes of ancient Iberian men from the Copper Age, before the steppe transition, and the Bronze Age, after it. Before the transition, the paternal lineages were overwhelmingly Neolithic Iberian in character. They carried haplogroups that traced back thousands of years to the early farmers and the hunter-gatherers who had been there since the Ice Age, since Malalmuerzo, since before any name existed for the land they lived on. After the transition, those lineages were gone. Nearly 100% of Bronze Age Iberian male genomes carried Y chromosomes of steppe origin. The transition happened over approximately 400 years. There is no recorded war to account for it. There are no mass graves. Stay with me, because this is the part that changes what you thought you knew about European prehistory. By 2000 BCE, nearly 100% of Iberian men, every paternal lineage that had existed in Spain for thousands of years, since the Ice Age refuges, since the cave at Malalmuerzo, had been replaced by men from the Russian steppe. No recorded war, no mass graves, no mechanism that population genetics has identified. The most complete demographic replacement of any male population in prehistoric Europe, and we have no explanation for it. None. Think about what that means in human terms. The descendants of the man in that Granada cave, the sons of sons stretching back 20,000 years in that same landscape, do not appear in the Bronze Age record. Their daughters appear. The maternal line survived, but the fathers, every father, from one end of the peninsula to the other, are gone, replaced by men from a steppe 3,000 miles to the east, in 400 years, without a name attached to what caused it. We looked at the Dinka in our last video, one of the most genetically continuous populations on Earth, a lineage that was never replaced, never erased. What we've just watched happen to the men of Iberia is the exact opposite. Drop in the comments. Which story stays with you longer? A population that was never displaced, or one that was replaced completely, with no record of how? And here is what survived. The female lineages from Neolithic Iberia, haplogroups H1 and U5b, carried in the mitochondrial DNA of the women who stayed, who blended, who raised children with the men who arrived from the steppe, are still detectable in living Spanish women today. 4,000 years later, the men are gone, the women are still here. For the next 2,000 years, the story of Iberia would be written in what came from outside, from the east, from Rome, from the Mediterranean. And then, from the south, something would arrive that would again change everything, and then be erased. 711 CE, a force crosses the Strait of Gibraltar, defeats the Visigothic king at the Battle of Guadalete, and within 3 years controls most of the Iberian Peninsula. The political event is recorded in extraordinary detail. Chronicles, accounts, treaties. The historical record of the Islamic arrival in Iberia is among the richest of any early medieval event in Europe. What the chronicles could not record, what wouldn't become knowable for 13 more centuries, was what it did to the DNA. A genomic study analyzing data from 1,413 modern Spanish individuals detected North African ancestry in the modern Spanish gene pool at regionally varying levels, higher in the south and east, lower in the north. and dated the admixture event to between 860 and 1120 CE, corresponding to the early period of Muslim rule. The signal was clear. The timing matched the historical record. The standard narrative appeared confirmed. The Islamic period brought North African ancestry into Iberia. The genomics agreed with the history books. Case settled. What they found next changed everything they thought they knew about when that ancestry arrived. In April 2025, Gonzalo Otogacia, affiliated simultaneously with the University of Huddersfield, Sapienza University of Rome, and Stockholm University, published a study in genome biology that did something no previous research had attempted. It used ancient DNA from eastern Iberia to track the North African genetic signal not just during the Islamic period, but before it. His team analyzed genomes from individuals in Valencia, spanning more than 1,000 years of burials. What they found was this. North African ancestry was present in Iberian individuals dated to the 4th and 5th centuries CE, not the 8th century, not after 711, the 4th and 5th centuries, before the Islamic conquest, before any Arab or Berber soldier had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, before Al-Andalus existed as a concept. The genetic bridge between Iberia and North Africa was already there. It had been forming during the Roman period, through trade, through migration, through the kind of Mediterranean movement that the Roman Empire made possible and that no chronicle thought worth recording in detail. Among the individuals in the study, 2 people from a late Roman cemetery in Gandia, Valencia, confirmed as biological relatives through DNA analysis, dated to the 4th-5th centuries CE, carrying North African genetic ancestry. They were not Muslim. They were not part of any conquest. They were Christian-era Romans with North African roots, buried in a Valencian hillside, whose existence no history book had predicted. The question that had appeared settled, when did North African ancestry enter Iberia, had just been reopened, pushed back at least 300 years, and pointed at a period that the standard narrative had left almost entirely blank. For centuries, the Morisco expulsions of 1609 CE were recorded as a religious and political event, the final removal of the last Muslim-descended communities from Spain. What nobody had asked until this study was what they removed from the DNA record. The answer was about to rewrite what Spanish genetics means today. September 22, 1609, the Spanish crown issued the decree of expulsion of the Moriscos. The targets were the descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, communities concentrated in Valencia, Aragon, and Murcia, many of whom had lived in Iberia for generations, in some cases for centuries, speaking Spanish, practicing Christian rites, with no living memory of anything else. Between 1609 and 1614, between 300,000 and 500,000 people were physically removed from the peninsula. They were transported to North Africa. Many went to the Ottoman Empire. Their property was confiscated. Their communities ceased to exist. The records are thorough. The crown was meticulous. What the crown could not have known, what nobody in 1609 could possibly have known, was that they were also performing a genomic event. The Oteo Garcia study tracked the North African genetic signal in eastern Iberia across ancient DNA samples spanning the Roman period through the 17th century. The result was unambiguous. North African ancestry, present and measurable in Iberian individuals from the Roman era, consolidating through the medieval Islamic period, persisting into the early modern, effectively disappears from the genomic record of eastern Spain. After 1609, the expulsion didn't just remove a religious community. It removed a genetic bridge that had been forming for over 1,000 years, and that absence is now measurable, not as an inference, as a number, a frequency that is lower than it should be. This isn't just medieval history. This is in your DNA right now, or rather in its specific engineered absence. The study also found something that had never appeared in any ancient DNA research on Iberia before. North African ancestry persisting inside a Christian cemetery in Valencia, an individual carrying North African genetic lineage, buried with Christian rites in a community that had been, on paper, fully converted and absorbed. The conversion was documented. The DNA was not converted. It was still there, under the cross, in the ground, carrying a lineage that the decree of expulsion would later declare gone. And then there is the individual whose remains were recovered with an iron shackle on the right leg. enslaved, from North Africa, buried in Valencian soil. Their genome is in the study. Their name was never recorded by anyone. The genetic fault line created by the Morisco expulsion maps almost precisely onto the regions of modern Spain, where the question of cultural and ethnic identity remains most politically active today. The same geography, the same east-west axis, Valencia, Murcia, Aragon, the regions where the expulsion was most concentrated, carry the lowest levels of North African ancestry in modern Spanish DNA. The war that was declared over in 1614 left a mark that can be read in a chromosome. And the question of where that mark belongs, to history, to politics, to someone's specific personal ancestry, has not been answered. It has only been located. There is one population in the Iberian Peninsula that did not follow the script. The steppe replacement happened around them, the Roman genetic transformation that added Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean ancestry to the rest of Iberia. Roughly a quarter of the modern Spanish and Portuguese genome passed them by almost entirely. The Islamic period that reshaped the genetics of Valencia, Andalusia, and the South barely registered in their DNA. They are the Basques, and their genetic profile is a forensic record of everything that did not happen to them. The Olalde-Reich study found that present-day Basques are the closest living genetic relatives to the Iron Age population of Iberia, the population that already existed after the Bronze Age steppe replacement, but before the Roman North African, and later admixture events that transformed everyone else. A research team at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona confirmed this. Basque genetic uniqueness is the result of continuous isolation since the Iron Age, not a separate origin, not an external arrival. The same Iberian substrate, simply never substantially blended with what came after. This finding was established across more than a decade of ancient DNA research. Almost nobody outside the specialist community connected what it implies about everyone else. Here is what it implies. The Basques didn't preserve something exceptional. They preserved what was normal before the replacements began. Their genetics represent the baseline. The default Iberian genetic profile, before Rome reshaped it, before the Mediterranean added its layer, before the political engineering of 1609 removed the North African signal from the east. Everyone else in Spain was transformed. The Basques were not. That's not Basque exceptionalism, it's Iberian context. The Basques are a control group, and what the control group shows is that every other region of Spain is several layers deep in events that the control group avoided. The Basque language, Euskara, is not related to any known language family. It is the last surviving remnant of the pre-Indo-European languages of Western Europe. The Indo-European languages that now cover the continent arrived with the steppe people and their descendants. The Basques kept their language because they minimized the same admixture that brought the linguistic transformation everywhere else. The language and the DNA say the same thing. They always have. And here is the last piece. Modern Iberian women, Spanish, Portuguese, Southern French, carry maternal haplogroups H1 and U5b that trace directly to the Neolithic and Ice Age populations of the peninsula, to the women who survived the Bronze Age replacement, to the women whose husbands, fathers, brothers vanished from the genetic record in 16 generations. Some ancestries don't erase, they wait, in the female line, across 4,000 years. Here is where the story stops being about ancient Spain. Here is where it becomes about you, not metaphorically, biologically. If you are a man of Iberian descent or of most Western European heritage, there is a high probability your direct paternal line carries Y-chromosome haplogroup R1b-DF27 or a closely related steppe-derived subclade. That haplogroup arrived in Iberia between 2500 and 2000 BCE. It replaced, at near total frequency, every paternal lineage that had existed there before, every line of men going back to the Ice Age, to the cave at Malumuerzo, to the 23,000-year-old person whose genome opened this story. The men whose lineage you carry did not write down what they replaced. They did not record what happened. They simply became the fathers of everyone who followed. Stay with this, because the second part does not resolve either. If you are a woman of Iberian descent, your maternal haplogroup, if it is H1 or U5b, may carry a direct line to the women who survived that replacement. the women whose male relatives vanished from the genetic record in the space of 16 generations. The women who stayed, who raised children with men from 3,000 miles away, whose daughters survived, whose daughters' survived. Down to you. The male line was replaced, the female line was not. Both of those facts are in use simultaneously. One tells the story of arrival, the other tells the story of endurance. Neither tells you what the transition actually was. If this is the kind of history you want to keep finding, the kind that doesn't simplify, doesn't flatten, doesn't give you a comfortable answer wrapped in national identity, this channel is where it lives. Subscribe and stay. And then there is the North African signal, present in some modern Spanish DNA in the eastern regions, at frequencies measurably lower than they would be if the Morisco expulsion of 1609 had never happened. The people who were removed left a negative space in the genome of the country that removed them. The absence is quantifiable. The people themselves are not in any database, any record, any name register that connects to the individuals. They are detectable only as a frequency that is lower than it should be. Their erasure is documented in what is no longer there. The 23-0-year-old person in the cave at Morisco. Their maternal haplogroup's descendants are still traceable in southern Iberia today. Their paternal line does not appear in any Bronze Age grave. Every person of Iberian descent who came after them carries, in some proportion, the story of what replaced what, and what survived, and what was removed by a decree issued in 1609 CE by a government that had no idea it was also editing a genome. The question is not whether you carry any of this. The question is which part.